The morning of February 19th, 1945, began with a silence that felt like the earth holding its breath. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi stood in the command post, buried 30 feet beneath Mount Suribachi, studying the maps spread before him with the calm precision of a man who had already accepted his fate. Above him, the volcanic island of Iwo Jima trembled under the heaviest naval bombardment in Pacific War history. For 74 consecutive days, American warships had pounded this 8-square-mile fortress of ash and sulfur. But Kuribayashi wasn't worried about the bombardment. He had prepared for this moment with a clarity that bordered on prophecy. His staff officers believed the Americans would exhaust themselves in 5 days, maybe a week at most, before withdrawing or settling into a costly stalemate. Kuribayashi knew better. He had walked the streets of America, seen their factories, understood their capacity for industrial violence. What troubled him that morning wasn't whether the Americans would come. They were already approaching the beaches. But whether his superiors in Tokyo would believe what he was about to tell them, that this island would not fall in 5 days, and that every hour beyond that estimate would cost the Americans so dearly they might reconsider their entire strategy for invading Japan itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The belief in a 5-day defense wasn't born from delusion, but from experience. Throughout 1944, Japanese commanders across the Pacific had watched American amphibious assaults follow a predictable pattern. The Marines would land with overwhelming force. The defenders would fight fanatically from prepared positions, and within 3 to 7 days, the battle would reach its conclusion, usually with the near total annihilation of the Japanese garrison in a final suicidal charge. Tarawa had fallen in 76 hours. Saipan lasted 3 weeks, but the outcome was never in doubt after the first week. Peleliu stretched to 2 months, but even that battle's first phase, the initial American penetration, lasted only days before devolving into a grinding cave-by-cave clearance. The pattern seemed immutable: fierce initial resistance, rapid American advance, final desperate banzai charge, then silence. But Kuribayashi had rejected this entire philosophy. The 53-year-old general had spent years in the United States during the 1920s, serving as a military attaché. He had driven across the American continent, visited Detroit's automobile factories, watched the machinery of American industry transform raw materials into finished products with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. While other Japanese officers dismissed America as a nation of soft, materialistic weaklings, Kuribayashi had written home to his wife with barely concealed alarm, "The United States is the last country in the world Japan should fight." His observations had earned him suspicion among the more fanatical officers in Tokyo, but they had also given him something his peers lacked: a realistic understanding of what Japan faced. When he arrived on Iwo Jima in June of 1944, Kuribayashi looked at the island with the eyes of an engineer rather than a samurai. The island was a volcanic anomaly, 8 square miles of black sand and gray ash dominated by the 550-foot extinct volcano Mount Suribachi at the southern tip. The terrain was hellish even by Pacific standards. The sand absorbed moisture and radiated heat, making every step an exhausting struggle. Sulfur vents released toxic gases that made breathing difficult in certain areas. There were no rivers, no natural water sources, no vegetation except scattered patches of scrub grass. Most Japanese commanders would have seen these features as obstacles to overcome. Kuribayashi saw them as weapons. His orders to the 21st Mixed Brigade, the 209th Infantry Division, and the Naval Guard forces under his command were revolutionary for the Japanese military. There would be no banzai charges. There would be no defense of the beaches. There would be no glorious death for the emperor in the first hours of battle. Instead, every man would become invisible. The island's volcanic rock was soft enough to excavate, but strong enough to withstand bombardment. Kuribayashi ordered his engineers to dig, not trenches, but an entire subterranean fortress. 11 miles of tunnels eventually connected over 1,500 cave positions. Some chambers were large enough to hold 300 men. Others were fighting positions barely wide enough for a single soldier and his rifle. The tunnels reached depths of 75 feet in some places, deep enough to survive anything short of a direct penetration by the heaviest naval shells. The defensive positions were designed with interlocking fields of fire that would turn the island's terrain into a killing ground. Every tunnel had multiple entrances and exits. Every position was designed to be abandoned and reoccupied as needed. Artillery pieces were mounted on rails inside tunnels, allowing them to be rolled out, fire several rounds, then disappear back into the mountain before counter-battery fire could target them. Machine gun nests were positioned to create crossfires that would catch Marines in exposed positions with no cover. Anti-tank guns were sighted to hit American Shermans in their vulnerable side armor as they attempted to climb the island's terraces. The entire defensive scheme was designed around a single principle: make the Americans pay for every yard in blood and time. But even with these preparations, Kuribayashi's staff officers maintained a curious optimism about how long the battle would last. Major Yoshitaka Horie, who commanded the nearby island of Chichijima and served as a logistics coordinator for Iwo Jima's garrison, later recalled that most officers expected the Americans to secure the beachhead and then face such horrific casualties that they would either withdraw or settle into a prolonged siege. The Japanese military culture still held that American forces lacked the stomach for sustained casualties. The 5-day estimate wasn't about holding the entire island for 5 days. It was about making those 5 days so costly that the Americans would reconsider their entire approach. After all, Japanese propaganda had spent years emphasizing American softness, their unwillingness to sacrifice, their dependence on material superiority rather than spiritual strength. Surely the reasoning went: if the initial assault cost enough American lives, their public would demand a negotiated peace rather than continued slaughter. Kuribayashi himself never explicitly endorsed the 5-day timeline, but he understood its psychological importance to his men. Let them believe they only needed to survive 5 days of maximum intensity. Let them think relief might come, or that American resolve might crack. The truth, which he kept to himself in those final weeks before the invasion, was darker and simpler. He had written to his wife months earlier, "I may not return alive from this assignment, but let me assure you that I shall fight to the best of my ability, so that no disgrace will be brought upon our family. I will fight as best I can." He had already scheduled the destruction of all unnecessary equipment and supplies. He had ordered the garrison to prepare for months of combat, not days. He had forbidden the traditional final telegram to Tokyo, announcing imminent death in glorious battle. Kuribayashi intended to fight until the Americans killed every last defender, and he knew that process would take far longer than 5 days. The American plan for invading Iwo Jima was built on a foundation of overwhelming force that reflected everything Kuribayashi had learned to fear about American military capabilities. Operation Detachment, as it was codenamed, committed 70,000 Marines from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions to the initial assault. The naval support force included 11 escort carriers, 6 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 40 destroyers, a fleet larger than the entire Japanese Navy possessed at this point in the war. The pre-invasion bombardment had already dropped 14,000 tons of explosives on the island. For 3 consecutive days before the landing, battleships and cruisers had fired at point-blank range, sometimes from as close as 2,000 yards offshore, systematically destroying every visible fortification. The Marines approaching the beach that morning had been told to expect fierce resistance, but they had also been told that the bombardment would have done most of the work. The briefing materials showed aerial photographs of an island that appeared devastated, cratered, stripped of anything resembling organized defenses. Intelligence estimates suggested the Japanese garrison numbered around 13,000 men. Accurate, as it turned out, though they missed the additional naval personnel, bringing the total closer to 21,000. The assault plan called for landing on the southeastern beaches, securing the narrow neck of the island, then pivoting to take Mount Suribachi in the south while simultaneously driving north toward the airfields. The optimistic projections suggested the island could be secured in 5 days to a week. The more cautious estimates gave it 2 weeks. No one seriously considered that the battle might stretch beyond a month. At 0900 hours, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches. The amphibious tractors struggled through the black volcanic sand, which offered no firm footing, and swallowed vehicles up to their treads. The Marines, scrambling out of the vehicles, found themselves on a beach that seemed abandoned. The terraced rises leading inland showed no movement, no muzzle flashes, no resistance at all. For perhaps 20 minutes, as wave after wave of Marines landed and struggled inland through the sucking sand, Iwo Jima remained eerily quiet. The men dug hasty fighting positions, waiting for the counterattack that Japanese doctrine promised would come within the first hour. Then Kuribayashi gave the order to open fire. The island exploded. Artillery and mortar shells began falling with precision that indicated pre-registered coordinates, covering every square yard of the landing beaches. Machine gun fire erupted from positions that had been invisible moments before. Camouflaged cave entrances, spider holes disguised as natural terrain features, reinforced bunkers that had absorbed days of naval bombardment without revealing their locations. The Marines found themselves caught in a killing zone with no cover except the volcanic sand that offered concealment but little protection from shells and bullets. The carefully planned advance inland stalled as units took casualties and went to ground, trying to identify where the fire was coming from. By nightfall of the first day, 30,000 Marines had landed on Iwo Jima. They had pushed inland in some places as far as 1,000 yards, cutting the island in half and isolating Mount Suribachi from the main Japanese positions to the north. But they had paid a price that shocked even the veterans of previous Pacific campaigns. More than 2,000 Marines were killed or wounded on the first day alone, a casualty rate that exceeded anything seen at Tarawa or Saipan in percentage terms. And perhaps most disturbing to the American commanders, the Japanese defenders showed no signs of cracking. There had been no banzai charges, no desperate counterattacks that might have exhausted the defenders. The Japanese simply faded back into their tunnel systems when positions became untenable, then reappeared to hit American advances from unexpected angles. In his command post beneath the island's surface, Kuribayashi received reports throughout that first day, with a mixture of satisfaction and grim resignation. His defensive plan was working exactly as designed. The Americans were paying heavily for every yard of progress. But he also knew that first day's success meant nothing in the larger calculus of the battle. The Marines had established their beachhead. Their supplies and reinforcements were flowing ashore, in quantities that his staff officers found difficult to believe. One observer noted that American landing craft were unloading ammunition and supplies faster than Japanese logistics could have distributed them, even under ideal conditions. The Americans were already bringing tanks ashore, along with flamethrower units and combat engineers equipped with explosives and demolition charges. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. What Kuribayashi understood, and what his staff was beginning to realize, was that the 5-day estimate had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of American military doctrine. The Japanese calculations assumed the Americans would fight the same kind of battle Japan would fight, one driven by dramatic gestures, by seeking decisive engagements, by trading territory for time. But the Americans didn't think in those terms. They thought in terms of systematic reduction, of applying overwhelming firepower and accepting casualties that Japanese culture considered unthinkable, of grinding forward yard by yard with the patience of men who knew they had unlimited resources behind them. By the 3rd day of battle, the Marines had secured Mount Suribachi and raised the American flag on its summit, the famous photograph that would become one of the most iconic images of the war. But taking Suribachi had cost another 1,000 Marine casualties, and the mountain represented only about 1/10 of the island's total area. The main Japanese defensive positions lay to the north, where the terrain became even more favorable for the defenders. The island's plateau was broken by ravines and ridges that channeled American advances into predetermined killing zones. Every ridge had to be taken individually, often at the cost of dozens of casualties. Every ravine became a strong point that required flamethrowers and demolition charges to reduce. The pattern of combat on Iwo Jima developed into something uniquely horrific, even by Pacific War standards. The Marines would identify a Japanese position, usually a cave entrance or reinforced bunker. They would call in artillery or naval gunfire, pounding the position until it seemed impossible anything could have survived. Then they would advance with infantry supported by tanks and flamethrower teams. Inevitably, the Japanese would open fire from positions the bombardment had failed to destroy, inflicting casualties until the Marines could bring direct fire to bear. Sometimes it took multiple assaults over several days to reduce a single defensive position. And even when a position fell, Japanese soldiers would infiltrate back through the tunnel systems at night, forcing the Marines to fight for the same ground repeatedly. Kuribayashi's communications with Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo during this period reveal his growing frustration with his superiors' inability to grasp what was happening on Iwo Jima. On February 23rd, the 4th day of battle, he sent a message reporting that American forces had taken Suribachi, but that the main defensive positions remained intact. He estimated his garrison had already inflicted 5,000 American casualties, but he also noted that American reinforcements and supplies showed no sign of diminishing, and that his own ammunition stocks were being consumed faster than anticipated. The message concluded with an ominous observation. The Americans were fighting with unprecedented tenacity and showed no indication of withdrawing regardless of casualties. Tokyo's response revealed the disconnect between battlefield reality and Imperial Headquarters understanding. The staff officers in Tokyo praised Kuribayashi's success in making the Americans pay dearly, and suggested that continued resistance would eventually force the Americans to negotiate. They spoke of 5-day victories and strategic withdrawals, using the language of maneuver warfare in a battle where maneuver was impossible. Kuribayashi's replies became increasingly blunt. There would be no withdrawal. There would be no relief force. The garrison would fight until ammunition ran out, then fight with bayonets and rocks, then die. The only question was how long that process would take and how many Americans they could kill before the end. By the end of the first week, the point at which optimistic Japanese planners had expected the battle to conclude, the Marines had secured roughly 1/3 of the island. But that third had cost them over 7,000 casualties, including more than 1,500 killed. The rate of loss was staggering, far exceeding any previous Pacific campaign, and the Japanese defensive positions in the northern part of the island appeared even stronger than those already reduced. The Marines were learning that Kuribayashi had concentrated his best troops and heaviest weapons in the complex of ridges and ravines that dominated the northern plateau. The second week of battle transformed Iwo Jima into a landscape that defied comprehension. Marines who had fought across Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan struggled to find words for what they were experiencing. The island had become a moonscape of overlapping shell craters, destroyed equipment, and the constant stench of sulfur mixed with death. Every morning brought the same grim
Mathematics. Gain 50 yards, lose 20 men. Secure a ridge, count the cost in dozens of casualties. The Japanese defenders, invisible in their underground fortress, continued to exact their toll with mechanical precision. And in his command post, now relocated deeper into the northern cave complex as American forces overran his original headquarters, Lieutenant General Kuribayashi was composing messages to Tokyo that read less like military reports and more like dispatches from another world. On March 1st, the 10th day of battle, twice the optimistic timeline, Kuribayashi sent a communication that marked a subtle shift in tone. He reported that his garrison had inflicted an estimated 12,000 American casualties, a figure that proved remarkably accurate. He noted that Marine tactics had evolved, that they were now using flamethrower teams and demolition charges as primary weapons, rather than relying on naval gunfire alone. Most significantly, he observed that the enemy shows no sign of wavering despite extraordinary losses. They advance with the patience of men who know time favors them. This last observation contained a truth that contradicted everything Japanese military doctrine taught about American character. The Marines weren't breaking. They weren't demanding withdrawal. They were simply grinding forward, absorbing casualties that would have destroyed Japanese morale, and continuing to fight with a methodical determination that Kuribayashi recognized from his years observing American industry. They were treating the battle like a production problem. Apply enough resources, accept the costs, and eventually achieve the objective. The Japanese garrison's situation was deteriorating in ways that weren't immediately apparent from the fighting. Water had always been scarce on Iwo Jima, and American bombardment had destroyed most of the cisterns and collection systems. Marines advancing through captured tunnel complexes found evidence of severe dehydration among the defenders. Bodies with swollen tongues, discarded canteens sucked dry, desperate attempts to collect condensation from tunnel walls. Food supplies were also dwindling. Kuribayashi had stockpiled ammunition with great efficiency, but the assumption had been that the battle would end quickly, one way or another. No one had planned for weeks of sustained combat with no resupply. By the second week, Japanese soldiers were surviving on half rations, then quarter rations. Some units reported eating grass and tree bark when they could reach the surface at night. Medical supplies presented an even grimmer picture. The underground hospital complexes that had seemed so innovative during construction became charnel houses as the battle progressed. Wounded Japanese soldiers lay in darkness on the tunnel floors, with no morphine for pain, no antibiotics for infections, and no possibility of evacuation. The sulfur fumes that permeated many of the deeper tunnels made breathing difficult for healthy men and agonizing for those with chest wounds. American forces occasionally heard screaming from sealed cave entrances. Sometimes the cries of wounded men, sometimes the sounds of mercy killings when officers judged that wounded soldiers had become a liability. The underground fortress that was supposed to make the garrison invulnerable had become a tomb where men died slowly in the darkness. Yet discipline held. This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Japanese defense, that even as conditions deteriorated and the hopelessness of the situation became apparent,
The garrison continued to fight with extraordinary effectiveness. There were no mass surrenders, no units breaking and fleeing. Individual soldiers occasionally emerged from caves to surrender, usually men driven mad by thirst or wounds, but these were exceptions. The vast majority of Kuribayashi's 21,000 defenders continued to man their positions, conserve their ammunition, and kill Marines with professional efficiency. The American casualties mounted with arithmetic inevitability. By March 5th, 2 weeks into the battle, Marine losses exceeded 10,000 men. The 3rd Marine Division, committed to the battle after the first week, was taking casualties at the same rate as the 4th and 5th Divisions before it. The news reaching the American public was beginning to cause the exact reaction Japanese planners had anticipated, but not in the way they expected. Rather than demanding withdrawal, the American public's anger was directed at whoever had planned this operation, whoever had chosen this particular island as a necessary objective. The political pressure wasn't to stop the battle, but to finish it as quickly as possible regardless of cost. This was the opposite of what Japanese doctrine predicted. American democracy wasn't making America weaker or less willing to fight. It was making the military more aggressive, more willing to accept casualties to achieve objectives quickly. On March 9th, 18 days into the battle, Kuribayashi sent what may have been his most revealing communication to Tokyo. The message was discovered after the war in captured Imperial General Headquarters files, and its tone marked a complete departure from the optimistic projections of the pre-invasion period. He wrote, "The situation has developed not necessarily to our advantage. Enemy forces continue to advance despite suffering casualties we estimate at 15,000 or more. Our ammunition reserves are at 30%. Water supplies are critical. Medical facilities are overwhelmed. The garrison continues to fight effectively, but the outcome cannot be in doubt. I estimate we can continue organized resistance for 2 more weeks, possibly 3. After that, individual units will fight independently until annihilated. There will be no withdrawal and no surrender. Request that our sacrifice be recorded accurately and that no false reports of victory be circulated." That final line, requesting that Tokyo not issue false victory claims, revealed Kuribayashi's understanding that he was fighting 2 battles. One was against the Marines grinding across his island. The other was against his own government's tendency to transform defeats into propaganda victories. He wanted the truth of Iwo Jima recorded. He wanted Japan's leadership to understand that his garrison had not been destroyed in 5 days because of some flaw in their fighting spirit or preparation. They were being destroyed slowly because the Americans possessed resources and determination that exceeded anything Japanese planning had accounted for. Tokyo's response to this message has never been found in surviving records, but subsequent communications suggest the Imperial General Headquarters still didn't grasp the fundamental realities Kuribayashi was describing. Staff officers in Tokyo continued to reference strategic defense and negotiated settlement as if these were realistic possibilities. They sent congratulatory messages praising the garrison's success in holding the island beyond the predicted timeline, as if survival itself constituted victory. They made no mention of the fact that every day the battle continued, the American grip on the island strengthened, while the Japanese position deteriorated beyond recovery. The fighting on Iwo Jima during the 3rd and 4th weeks settled into a pattern of horrific repetition. The Marines would identify a Japanese strong point, perhaps a ridge line where interlocking defensive positions commanded all approaches. Artillery and naval gunfire would pound the position for hours, sometimes days. Then infantry would advance, supported by tanks and flamethrower teams. The Japanese would wait until the Americans were exposed, then open fire from positions that had somehow survived the bombardment. Marines would go to ground, call in more fire support, and try again. Eventually, through sheer persistence and overwhelming firepower, they would overrun the position. Then they would discover that the Japanese had already evacuated through the tunnels, falling back to the next defensive line, ready to repeat the process. Colonel Kanehiko Atsuchi, commanding the defense of the northern sector, sent his final message to Kuribayashi on March 15th, 24 days into the battle. The Americans had overrun his command post, forcing him and his remaining staff deeper into the cave systems. His message reported that his regiment, originally numbering 2,000 men, now counted fewer than 300 effective fighters. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Most of his remaining men were wounded, some multiple times. Yet the tone of his message was almost serene. "We have exceeded all expectations. The enemy has paid the price we demanded. If we can hold 3 more days, we will have fought for 4 weeks, a length of time that will force them to reconsider their entire strategy. We will continue until the last man falls." 3 more days. Atsuchi believed that reaching the 1-month mark would somehow represent a psychological victory, a demonstration that Japanese forces could hold against American might far longer than anyone predicted. But he was killed the following day when American forces sealed his cave position with demolition charges. His 300 remaining men fought for 2 more days in isolated pockets before being systematically eliminated. The 3 more days he hoped for were achieved, but not in the organized defense he envisioned, just in the time it took for the Americans to find and destroy every last defender. By March 20th, the battle had been raging for 29 days, nearly 6 times the optimistic 5-day estimate. The Marines controlled 90% of the island's surface, but that final 10%, concentrated in the rugged terrain of the northern tip, still contained an estimated 3,000 Japanese defenders in caves and tunnels that seemed impossible to reduce. The Marine divisions that had landed in February were no longer recognizable as the same units. Entire companies had been rebuilt 2 or 3 times as casualties mounted. Battalion commanders were leading units that bore the same designation but consisted almost entirely of replacement troops. The psychological toll was becoming as serious as the physical casualties. Marines who had survived weeks of this grinding combat were beginning to show signs of what would later be recognized as severe combat stress. 1,000-yard stares, inability to sleep, violent reactions to sudden noises. Kuribayashi's communications during this final week took on an elegiac quality. He knew the end was approaching, that organized resistance would soon become impossible. On March 21st, he sent a message that read more like a letter than a military report. For 29 days, this garrison has held against the most powerful military force in history. We have inflicted casualties exceeding 25,000 on the enemy. We have demonstrated that Japanese soldiers, properly positioned and supplied, can exact a terrible price from any invader. But the enemy's resources are inexhaustible. Their determination exceeds their casualties. Their material superiority is so complete that our spiritual strength, great as it is, cannot overcome it. In 3 to 5 days, I will lead the remaining men in a final attack. After that, Iwo Jima will fall. I request that the Emperor be informed that every man of this garrison has done his duty beyond all reasonable expectation. That message, recovered after the war from captured headquarters files, contains no mention of the 5-day estimate. The timeline had become irrelevant. What mattered to Kuribayashi in those final days was that the historical records show his garrison had held far beyond what anyone thought possible, and that the failure to hold indefinitely was not a failure of will or courage, but a simple mathematical reality. You cannot defeat industrial capacity with spiritual strength. You cannot overcome material superiority through determination alone.
These were lessons Japan's leadership needed to learn, and Kuribayashi was writing them in the blood of his garrison and the Americans attacking him. The final organized Japanese attack came on March 26th, the 36th day of battle. Kuribayashi led approximately 300 survivors, the remnants of a 21,000-man garrison, in a pre-dawn assault against American positions near the island's northern tip. It wasn't a banzai charge in the traditional sense. The men moved silently through the darkness, using their remaining grenades and bayonets to infiltrate American lines. Kuribayashi himself was reportedly killed during this action, though his body was never definitively identified. The attack was crushed within hours, with nearly all the Japanese participants killed, but it marked the end of organized resistance. After March 26th, only isolated holdouts remained, individuals or small groups hiding in sealed cave systems, slowly dying of thirst and starvation. The official American declaration that Iwo Jima was secured came on March 26th, exactly 36 days after the initial landing. The statistics told a story that shook even the most optimistic American planners. Marine casualties totaled 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed, the highest casualty rate of any Marine operation in the Pacific War. Every Marine division committed to the battle had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force and required complete reconstitution. The Japanese garrison had been virtually annihilated. Only slightly more than 1,000 prisoners were taken from a force of 21,000, a survival rate of less than 5%. But the most disturbing statistic from the American perspective was the ratio. For every Japanese defender killed, the Marines had suffered 1.25 casualties, killed or wounded. This was unprecedented. At Tarawa, the ratio had been roughly 1 American casualty for every 2 Japanese killed. At Saipan, 1 American casualty for every 3 Japanese killed. On Iwo Jima, the Japanese had made the Americans pay nearly equally for the island's conquest. This ratio suggested something deeply troubling to American planners looking ahead to the invasion of Japan itself. If the Japanese could defend an 8-square-mile island this effectively, what would the cost be to invade the Japanese home islands? The answer to the question posed by the video's title, "What did Japanese generals say when Marines took Iwo Jima in 36 days instead of 5, exists in the fragmentary surviving communications and the post-war testimonies of the few staff officers who witnessed events from nearby islands. Major Yoshitaka Hori, commanding Chichijima, and one of the last officers to receive communications from Kuribayashi, later wrote that the extending timeline produced a complex mixture of pride and horror among Japanese commanders who understood what was happening. Pride that the garrison had exceeded all expectations, holding out more than 7 times longer than predicted. Horror at what that extended resistance revealed about the coming battle for Japan itself. The 5-day estimate, Hori explained in his post-war memoirs, had never been about optimism. It had been about hope. Hope that a quick, costly defense would shock the Americans into reconsidering their invasion strategy. When the battle stretched to 2 weeks, then 3, then beyond a month, that hope transformed into something else. Japanese commanders watching from Tokyo and from other Pacific bastions began to understand that the Americans would never stop, never reconsider, never accept anything short of complete victory regardless of casualties. The extended resistance on Iwo Jima proved Japanese soldiers could fight with extraordinary effectiveness. But it also proved that effectiveness didn't matter. The Americans would simply accept the casualties, bring forward more men and more supplies, and continue grinding forward until nothing remained to oppose them. General Kuribayashi's final words, as reported by survivors of that last attack, were addressed to his remaining officers. "I have failed, not in the defense of this island,
We have held longer than anyone thought possible. I have failed to make them stop. We have killed thousands, and still they come. We have held for 5 weeks, and it changes nothing. They will take this island, then they will take the next one, and the next, until they reach Japan itself. And nothing we do here will change that outcome. This was the real answer to what Japanese generals said, not in the immediate aftermath of the 5-day estimate proving wrong, but in the dawning realization over those 36 days that the timeline itself was irrelevant. Whether the island fell in 5 days or 5 weeks, the outcome remained the same. The Americans possessed resources so vast and determination so complete that Japanese defensive excellence, even at its absolute peak, could only delay but never prevent their advance. The 5-day estimate had been built on a foundation of hope that American resolve would crack, that democratic publics couldn't stomach sustained casualties, that material superiority could be overcome through spiritual strength and tactical brilliance. Iwo Jima destroyed those hopes completely. The Americans had suffered casualties that should have broken democratic resolve, and they had simply absorbed the losses and continued fighting. They had faced defensive positions designed by one of Japan's most innovative commanders, and they had reduced them through systematic application of overwhelming firepower. They had encountered Japanese soldiers fighting with extraordinary skill and determination, and they had killed nearly all of them while accepting exchange ratios that would have been considered catastrophic in any previous war. The irony that Kuribayashi had recognized from the beginning, that understanding American power made defeat inevitable but resistance still necessary, became the central tragedy of the Pacific War's final months. The Japanese military leadership learned from Iwo Jima that their soldiers could fight with almost superhuman effectiveness, that defensive preparations could multiply the cost of American advances, that the timeline could be extended far beyond initial estimates. But they also learned that none of it mattered. The Americans would pay the price, whatever it was, and continue advancing. The choice facing Japan was not between victory and defeat, but between accepting defeat now or forcing the Americans to inflict it yard by bloody yard across the home islands. In the months following Iwo Jima's fall, Japanese defensive planning for the home islands incorporated the lessons of Kuribayashi's extended defense. They would build more tunnels, prepare more interlocking defensive positions, train civilians to resist to the death. They would turn every city into a fortress, every town into a killing ground, every rice paddy into a defensive position. They estimated they could hold out for months, perhaps years, inflicting casualties so severe that the Americans would have to negotiate. The 5-day estimate had become a 6-month estimate, then a 1-year estimate, each one assuming that at some point the accumulation of American casualties would force a change in strategy. They were wrong about that too, but they never got the chance to prove it. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 ended the war before the invasion of Japan could begin. The battle that would have made Iwo Jima look like a skirmish never happened. The American casualties that might have numbered in the hundreds of thousands or millions were never inflicted. The Japanese defenders who would have fought with the same determination Kuribayashi's garrison showed never got to demonstrate that determination. The extended timeline that Japanese planners hoped would change American strategy instead convinced American leadership that invasion would be too costly, that other means, terrible means, but potentially less costly in total lives, had to be employed. The 36 days of Iwo Jima taught both sides lessons they had hoped not to learn. The Americans learned that even a small, isolated garrison could extract an almost unbearable price if properly prepared and led. This knowledge influenced the decision to use atomic weapons rather than invade, a calculation of casualties that traded certain Japanese civilian deaths against projected American military losses and potential Japanese military and civilian casualties from an invasion. The Japanese learned that their most optimistic defensive
predictions were simultaneously too pessimistic and too optimistic. Too pessimistic because their soldiers could hold far longer than 5 days. Too optimistic because holding longer didn't change the outcome. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's body was never found. He disappeared during that final attack on March 26th, one among hundreds of bodies that littered the battlefield in the pre-dawn darkness. Some reports suggested he committed ritual suicide after the attack failed. Others claimed he was killed by rifle fire as his men retreated. A few persistent legends held that he survived the battle and lived in the cave systems until he eventually died of wounds or starvation weeks later. The truth doesn't matter much. What matters is what he wrote in those final communications, the evolution of his messages from tactical reports to philosophical reflections on the nature of the war Japan was fighting. His last confirmed message, sent on March 25th, contained a passage that summarized everything the extended timeline of Iwo Jima had revealed. We have held this island for 35 days. In that time we have learned that bravery cannot defeat industry, that courage cannot overcome resources, that spiritual strength cannot prevail against material supremacy. These are hard lessons for soldiers raised on different principles, but they are true lessons, and Japan must learn them. The Americans will win this war not because they are braver. Our soldiers have proven equal in courage. They will win because they have more of everything, and because their democracy makes them stronger, not weaker. This last point would have seemed impossible before this battle, but I have watched them absorb casualties that would destroy any Japanese unit, and simply continue fighting. Their system produces this determination. Our system, for all its emphasis on spirit and sacrifice, cannot match it. That passage, discovered in captured headquarters files and verified by multiple historians, represents perhaps the most devastating critique of Japanese military philosophy ever written by a Japanese general. Kuribayashi had been proven right in his pre-war assessment that America was the last country Japan should fight, and the 36 days of Iwo Jima had proven why. Not because Americans were better soldiers, but because American society could generate and sustain military power on a scale that Japanese society, for all its mobilization and sacrifice, could not match. The 5-day estimate had been wrong, but being wrong in that particular way, holding out 7 times longer than predicted, only made the final truth more devastating. If Japan's best troops, led by one of its most innovative commanders, fighting from ideal defensive positions, could hold 36 days instead of 5, and still lose completely while inflicting unprecedented casualties, what hope was there for defending the home islands? The question answered itself. There was no hope. There was only the choice between accepting that reality and forcing the Americans to demonstrate it across every inch of Japanese territory. The generals in Tokyo, receiving Kuribayashi's increasingly bleak messages over those 36 days, said many things. Some praised his extended defense as a model for future battles. Some claimed his garrison's sacrifice had bought valuable time for home island preparations. Some insisted that the extraordinary American casualties proved Japanese defensive doctrine was working. But in their private communications, in their planning sessions, in their increasingly desperate strategizing about how to defend Japan itself, they revealed what they truly learned from Iwo Jima, that the 5-day estimate had been a fantasy, that the 36-day reality was still a defeat, and that no amount of time or casualties would change the war's ultimate outcome. They had learned, too late, what Kuribayashi had known from the beginning, that understanding American power made resistance seem futile, but Japanese military culture made surrender impossible. So they would fight on, extending the timeline from 5 days to 36, from 36 days to months, hoping against hope that somehow, at some point, the accumulation of American casualties would matter. It never did. The Americans simply paid the price and continued advancing. And that, more than any tactical detail or casualty figure, was what Japanese generals said when Marines took Iwo Jima in 36 days instead of 5. They said nothing that mattered, because they had already lost the war, and they were only beginning to understand it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.